individuals in capitalism are more or less coerced into acting in particular ways by the system itself.
Jobless growth is actually not an aberration, but written into the nature of neoliberal growth, the neoliberal model.
I think democracy, in a true sense, is not realizable within capitalism.
Prabhat, thank you so much for being here today. The world as we see it is in enormous crisis and turmoil around the world. Enormous wealth has been created, but the neoliberal promise that everybody will be better off because jobs would be created, decent work opportunities, we wouldn't need the state, people would be able to buy everything that they want from the market, corruption would be controlled because regulations would be reduced. There was a whole range of promises. I think enormous wealth has been created, unbelievable levels, but a lot of the other promises are falling by the wayside. And the last decade and a half in India has been not only one of jobless growth, but also formal decent work employment has actually rapidly declined, and instead we are witnessing the only kind of work that is available to large millions of our people is uncertain, unsecured kind of work. And the newest crisis that I was reading about, in fact, perhaps in today's or yesterday's newspaper, was on a deceleration even of effective demand in the economy. So in the context of this, the alternative imagination of a society that was built around socialist principles, many people believe or assume that alternative imagination died with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and that we were living through the triumph of one economic idea, which was of neoliberalism. I've heard you speak about, and you're one of the most respected economists, but I would also say, in a sense, a philosopher about how our economy and public policy should be managed. You have been speaking about universal social rights as perhaps the key of an alternative imagination. I heard you somewhere say that it is the new class struggle. So how would you explain this idea of universal social rights, and where do you see it as offering an alternative imagination?
Well, it's based on my view of capitalism. I believe that capitalism is in fact what I call a spontaneous system. It is driven by its own inner logic. Individuals in capitalism are more or less coerced into acting in particular ways by the system itself. Interestingly, Marx had called the capitalist, supposedly the hero of the system, as capital personified. In other words, capital is in fact working through the person of the capitalist. Now, one of the tendencies of capitalism is that any restrictions on capital also tend to get spontaneously overturned. Now, this is what Keynesianism, for instance, had advocated, and in the post-Second World War period, this is what the world saw, that basically you can have regulated capitalism, welfare capitalism, and so on. But as a matter of fact,
with massive state interventions.
Massive state intervention.
But largely wasn't the Keynesian idea largely one around employment, the state intervention for employment?
But employment in America was provided through an expansion in aggregate demand that was essentially because of military expenditure. But employment in Europe was essentially through welfare expenditure. So that, European social democracy enlarged employment, took these economies close to full employment, and at the same time provided a welfare state. And everybody thought that that was, as it were, the possible within capitalism, and therefore the argument for socialism, in a sense, had become irrelevant. But on the other hand, now we know that the moment capital felt strong enough, overcame the existential crisis which it had got into in the post-Second World War period, when there was massive workers' uprising all over Europe, when there was a socialist threat with the Red Army possibly marching into large parts of Europe and threatening the rest. The moment that got over and capital consolidated its position, you now find that, as a matter of fact, neoliberal capitalism reintroduces the spontaneity of the system. Now, to the extent that is the case, I believe,
and the retreat of the state,
and the retreat of the state, and an attenuation of the welfare measures, which has proceeded to varying extents in different countries. But on the other hand, there is no denying it. Okay, it has proceeded much further in Southern Europe than in Northern Europe, etc.
The UK has also seen a large,
UK also has seen substantial erosion of the welfare state measures. And in any case, there is substantial unemployment over large parts of Europe. So the thing is that, that it's in that context that I see the question of rights, that the provision of rights is something which is, particularly I'm talking about economic rights, like right to employment and so on, is really not compatible with neoliberal capitalism or compatible with capitalism in its spontaneity. And so I see class struggle over rights as a transitional phenomenon that would lead on to socialism.
But Scandinavian countries held on for much longer.
Yes.
But
yes.
Didn't they demonstrate the possibility of capitalism coexisting with the idea of a welfare state?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They did for a very long period of time. In fact, they did, and in many ways, the welfare state measures have not been as much dismantled in the Scandinavian countries as they have been elsewhere. But the point is, the tendency towards capitalism dismantling the welfare state measures is evident everywhere. And as a result, you would actually find that it is going to be difficult, particularly to sustain the welfare state measures, even in these countries. And certainly in countries of the South, the welfare state measures hardly ever got introduced.
But describing it as the new class struggle, if you could, is that an idea that you've thought through with some degree of nuance, or it is more about we need to organize around universal social rights?
Well, I would not say it is the new class struggle, but fundamentally we have an idea that class struggle is organized around economic demands of the class itself, which is obviously not true, because class struggle is organized around demands that actually affect people as a whole. The Bolshevik Revolution was an expression of an intense class struggle around the questions of land, peace, and bread. Okay? So the point is, the moment you see class struggle in that way, namely that it is around an agenda which becomes historically relevant in particular periods of time, I believe the agenda that is relevant, certainly in the South today, is an agenda about rights. Because what you see now is, on the one hand, neoliberal capitalism, On the other hand, this is complemented by a kind of identity politics, or was complemented. Now, in India, for instance, identity politics is being taken over by Hindutva politics, but nonetheless, it was an identity politics is fragmenting people, and obviously, identity politics cannot conceivably provide welfare state measures to every individual. The whole idea of it is that my group gets it and not some other group.
So would you say it's a class struggle founded on notions of solidarity and fraternity?
Absolutely. Yeah. You see, because when Marx criticized, there's a lot of opposition to it on the left, and that derives from Marx's writings.
Yeah, in fact, that was my next question, that as a traditional Marxist, and I'm sure you would still think of yourself as a Marxist scholar, a lot of traditional Marxists have opposed the idea of human rights and felt that it is in some sense atomizing the individual, and the idea of the class struggle is built on the idea of class solidarity. So how do you?
Yes, it derives from Marx's comments in his early essay on the Jewish question. Right. Now, on that, there has been a lot of discussion and so on, what exactly Marx meant. But you see, on the Jewish question is actually Marx's critique of liberalism. That's basically the essence of that essay. And in that, Marx is making a philosophical critique of liberalism, that the liberal utopia is really not human freedom. Now, if you have individuals enjoying rights and so on, now that is a liberal utopia, but that is not enough, because the
collective has,
exactly. It's important for people to develop a new community, a new sense of solidarity, which is what socialism would bring. So I completely agree with that. But because of what I was saying earlier, namely that capitalism is a spontaneous system, any struggle for individual rights is not something that capitalism want to concede. If you have right to employment, now which capitalist country can do that, because capitalism cannot function without a substantial reserve army of labor. Now, that being the case, for fighting for these rights, you would have to have class struggle and build solidarities. Therefore, if you achieve these rights, if at all, you would achieve them within a world which itself is socialist, and within a world in which that individual enjoying the rights is ensconced within a community with a sense of solidarity. Now, if it is possible that the individual can achieve some rights within capitalism, so much the better, then the individual can proceed to fight for other rights.
But staying with this debate a little bit longer, for myself, for instance, I see myself strongly located in the left, and yet I believe that 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was a very important moment in human civilization, in a sense, because I felt it was based on the recognition of the equal dignity and worth of every human being. So as a Marxist, how would you respond to that formulation, in a sense?
No, I applaud that formulation, but the point is, I think that's a formulation which, strictly speaking, is not realizable, in my view, within capitalism. Exactly, it is very, very similar to my view on democracy. I think democracy, in a true sense, is not realizable within capitalism. Ideally, democracy is something which really requires not a commoditization of aspects of spheres of life, not an atomization of people, but it requires that people collectively have to take decisions, which is not possible under capitalism. It requires socialism.
So the idea of universal social rights, of course, has been attacked much more from the right than from the left. And a market fundamentalist would believe that in my own experience, even Dr. Manmohan Singh, I used to see him functioning, and he genuinely believed that ideas of welfare and social rights was actually going to harm the economy from its untrammeled sort of potential of massive growth, which in the end would solve all problems. and the Amartya Sen and Bhagwati debate was again a sort of celebrated example of this discussion. So the idea from a market fundamentalist that states are inherently corrupt, slothful, inefficient, rent-seeking, and the markets are efficient, and it would be best for markets to function. You don't need the state, and in the end, you will have jobs and you'll be better off, and you can buy your rights to healthcare and education from the market much more reliably than get it from the state. That argument from the market fundamentalist side, how would you respond to that?
You see, the idea of the efficiency of the market is something which really got discredited about 90 years ago, because the point is that that efficiency, or the fact that the market efficiently uses resources, implies that all resources must be used up. So if you actually have huge unemployment, if you have unutilized capacity, if you have food stocks lying around, in that case, obviously, the system is not functioning efficiently. And that was the case in the 30s, that is the case even now. As a result, the market does not function efficiently. What about the idea of growth? Now, I think simply amassing larger and larger means of production does not really solve the problem of poverty and so on, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks. In fact, as Marx had said, that capitalism's spontaneous tendency is to produce wealth at one pole and poverty at another. Therefore, the sheer production of wealth is something which is not a panacea for overcoming poverty, but it's simply the other side of the accentuation of poverty. In fact, I would like to kind of make one comment about what you said earlier, that that in the period of neoliberal capitalism in India, not only is it the case that inequalities have increased, but actually you find that there is an increase in absolute deprivation. In the sense that, for instance, you look at per capita food intake. Okay, the proportion of people who were below 2,200 calories per person per day in rural India, which is supposed to be the benchmark for poverty, in let's say 1993-4 was about 58%. You look at 2011, it's 68%. In urban India, correspondingly, it is 57 and 65%. Now, what has happened, for instance, is that now education is much more expensive, healthcare is much more expensive, none of which gets captured in the consumer price index, and as a result, people are forced to spend so much on these that they actually skimp on buying food. Now, the point is, you could say, look at this, the poor people are now going to Max Hospital, so they're better off. But on the other hand,
what sacrifices they're making.
That's right. Yeah. So the fact that they are actually consuming less is symptomatic of a decline in their real income per capita.
Yeah, in fact, Amartya Sen, I was hearing him once, and it stayed with me, that he said that if we see India and China as equally unequal, the penalty of unequal living in an unequal society is much greater in India. Because if I belong to the bottom 10% in India, my child, in China, I would be able to send my child still to a decent school and get healthcare. In India, I would not. And I think that recognition is there. Yeah. Even so, this argument continues. And I remember Mr. Bhagwati, Dr. Bhagwati and Amartya Sen's debate. At one point he said that Amartya Sen kept saying, I still believe in the market along with universal social rights. And Dr. Bhagwati responded, that's like people saying that I have friends I still have Jewish friends, but I'm not biased or some such. So I
but I don't agree with Amartya Sen. When we say
that's exactly it. So where is your imagination of the market in your imagination of universal social rights?
You see, the idea of the market is much misunderstood. You see, because the market can have all kinds of roles. The market as a social reality, as it functions is quite different from the market as a means of distributing means of consumption. Okay, in other words, even in socialist society, even in the Soviet Union, you had a market. But the role of the market in the Soviet Union was completely different from the role of the market that you find in the capitalist economy, which is a commodity producing economy. Now, in an economy like this, the market actually has a certain logic. Okay. In a socialist economy, the market's role has been circumscribed in a way that it does not have that kind of a logic. Okay. Now, this logic of the market in a capitalist economy is actually to create differentiation among people, So commodity production, not just capitalist commodity production, but commodity production tends to differentiate among producers. Okay. In capitalism, that's even greater. You find that among capitalists, for instance, the big capital tends to become stronger and stronger, bigger compared to small capital, which is what we are seeing now with neoliberal capitalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And the role of the state in such a society is actually to aid and abet this differentiating role of the market.
And almost the death of the petty producer.
That's right, exactly.
Saying,
I mean, Modi's demonetization is simply something which is aiding and abetting and accelerating
something that was already happening.
That's right,
Absolutely,
something
yes.
which is already happening. Now, in that sense, I don't know what Professor Sen means by I believe in the market. I certainly don't believe in the market as an overall regulatory role. I don't believe in commodity production as, but on the other hand, there can be market playing limited roles in very many different ways,
Right. But I mean, before proceeding, I think we need to acknowledge that both you and Dr. Amartya Sen passionately believe in universal social rights.
Yes.
But it is possible for you to be allies in that conviction and still have different views about the role of the of the capitalist of capitalism and the market.
Yes,
you would admit to that.
Absolutely. I don't know what Professor Sen thinks these days about socialism. As you know, he taught me, and I keep in touch with him. But but I mean, he certainly votes left. But whether he actually believes in socialism,
he votes
I don't
left.
know.
He sees himself as somebody from
very
the left.
much so. Yeah.
But in this conversation, when he was almost defensively defending the capitalist market, I found it interesting, and I feel that we'll have to continue a clarification about if we move towards universal social rights, what is going to be the nature of the market and its role. One of the, I was struck by the latest World Development Report, which is the first some sort of major admission from the Bretton Woods set of institutions that actually we may not be able to produce jobs. This was the first time that we actually saw that jobless growth is actually not an aberration, but almost written into the nature of neoliberal growth, the neoliberal model, which I think lot of us have been recognizing, but I think they acknowledge it for the first time. But the solution that they want to give is therefore a universal basic income. To me, apart from everything else, I mean, more from a philosophical and ethical perspective, the idea of assuring millions of people the ability to survive without the dignity of work is frightening to me from an ethical perspective as well. I can't think of a humankind where people have to live without the dignity of work. But that apart, there is, I saw in this election the small attempts at bringing in the economy by the Congress party, for instance, was substantially built around a notion of not a universal basic income, but some kind of income support. And there are others, their friends like in Seva, who are very passionately supporters of this idea. I've had many debates with Renana and other friends there. They clarify that they're not talking about it as a substitute to welfare transfers like food, but a top up to that. So there are many kinds of ideas of the universal basic income. But do you feel there's a place for it in your imagination of the universal social right idea?
If we have universal social rights, let's say we have a right to employment, failing which the person should be given a wage. In other words, getting a wage should not then be tied to simply getting employment. Now, if so, then the idea of a universal basic income becomes irrelevant, because everybody has a justiciable right to work. The problem with the universal basic income is that suppose you hand over a certain amount of money. In that case, there are all kinds of questions. If it's a top-up, then how much are you getting so that the additional amount can be calculated, etc.
The Congress was talking about a top-up, which was a very almost impossible to implement.
Exactly. But if suppose everybody gets a certain amount of money, but the point is that suppose you don't have a school within a certain radius, you don't have a hospital within a certain radius, you actually have to go to some private hospital. In that case, the idea of simply handing you money just doesn't help. It's very important that actually services, essential commodities must be made available to everybody, including work opportunities. And this is what the welfare state actually promised.
Also, I feel that it is blind to the idea. Suppose I have a disabled child. I have many more economic needs than a person who does not have a child with disabilities. So a basic income idea and a top-up idea also is blind to that question as well.
Yes.
My next question is, you're talking about universal social rights. Which rights are we speaking about?
Well, actually you can think in terms of a very wide range of rights. But in my writings, I've been talking essentially about five rights, 5 economic rights, which is, I'm not sticking to the 5. I don't find that these 5 somewhere have priority over other possible rights.
And these 5 are employment, healthcare, education, school education.
School education, healthcare, employment, pension and food.
And food and nutrition, I guess.
That's right, yeah. So I'm talking about just these 5 because I made some calculations based on these 5. That's the thing. Obviously, housing is very important.
I struggle because I work with homeless populations, and I recognize how actually the absence of housing makes you vulnerable to a whole range of deprivation. If I'm homeless, I can't send my child to school, I can't study, I can't have safe delivery, I can't breastfeed my child. So all the other rights get complicated. So housing was one, but also, just out of interest, would you place higher education in your universal social rights?
I would, but that is something which I would like. I imagine would come in subsequently, because at this moment there are so many school dropouts and so many people who can't even go to school that I think the priority would be school education.
But Satish Deshpande and Apurvanand have done a chapter for our exclusion report. It's it's a really wonderful chapter, where they talked about higher education as actually being in our society the only available mode of social mobility for people of disadvantaged castes and gender, but it's also the site of great discrimination. So it's paradoxically both.
Right.
And we're seeing what is playing out in what JNU was and what JNU is becoming there. So I feel that a position, I'm not sure higher education, public funded higher education can be postponed if we are going to battle inequalities. And that brings me also to another related question, Prabhat, which is about the social. You're talking about economic rights. The formulation normally is social and economic rights. So So for a person from a disadvantaged caste who is trapped in a humiliating profession, or women, or a person with disabilities, etc., there are a number of social rights that we'll have to somehow weave into the imagination of economic rights. So what would you think about that? And
No, I would agree with both your points. I would agree with the point about higher education.
Right.
I would also agree with your point about social rights. But I was simply floating this idea of a certain set of rights which immediately, I made some calculations, they are immediately implementable, and what is more, I just thought that one could make a noise around
yeah.
them. Yeah.
I mean, that is not a
That is
utopia.
not an exhaustive, not at all. That's not my utopia. In fact, my utopia is socialism. And actually, in fighting for these rights, you would build up a kind of, a sense of community, a sense of class solidarity that would carry you to socialism, where you would have a lot more than these rights actually getting realized.
Just looking at the politics in India today, I think we're passing through such a difficult moment where there was a cartoon which I saw the other day where there's a curfew outside and there's this man trapped inside, and he's saying, "Can I get out?" And the man is the economic crisis. So the economic crisis is sort of somehow this time round we're seeing it almost becoming like if I don't have work, or if I don't have all my social rights, at least I'm becoming part of a powerful Hindu nation. So there's, in India it seems to have just vanished from public discourse with the kind of urgency that is required. But even elsewhere in the world, we are seeing the rise of political leaders quite similar in many ways to the one that we have elected. So do you even think that the conversations around universal social rights are going to emerge? You do hear Bernie Sanders and you do hear Corbyn in some of the democracies. We're not hearing, the odd remark by Rahul Gandhi in the middle of the election campaign were the only straws that one could catch where there's some conversation about economic rights and social rights for the disadvantaged. So do you think it's politically anywhere possible in India?
Well, I think the Hindu right has hijacked the political discourse. In some sense, we have to recapture the political discourse around the question of the economy, how to improve people's living and so on. Now, the thing is that, you can do any amount of propaganda about what you did to Pakistan, about all kinds of things, but you can't hide economic realities. Economics in that sense, actually one day your economic crisis, which is as it were kind of captured, is bound to come out. So to that extent, our job should be to help it to come out. Okay, and we can do that by pushing this discourse much more into the public domain. I think one of the things that happened earlier is that in some sense much of the opposition was really caught in the discourse of the Hindu right. If they were saying something, we were saying, no, they're wrong. But I think we ought to now,
have the confidence of our own position.
The time that the discourse got kind of somewhat interrupted is when there was the Kisan March, first in Maharashtra and then here. But I think if the momentum of that had been maintained, in that case we could have started a new discourse. But I think we should do it now.
But there's also the question of what Paulo Freire called conscientization. Do you think that those of us ranged on the left with many agreements and some disagreements have done too little to battle in the battle of ideas? When I see Bengal, for instance, and the fact that people who've been with the Marxist Party for 35 years can so easily travel into the BJP, to my mind, seems to suggest that we haven't worked enough in the battle of ideas. Is that something that you feel we need to do more of?
I would say, okay, I think the Bengal case is different because I think in Bengal what happened was, which is probably happening in Kerala as well, is that the left in some sense gets hegemonized by neoliberalism. And they do so because they are hemmed in a particular state, a fiscal problem and all kinds of things, okay. But whatever the reason, the left got hegemonized by the neoliberal paradigm. But the point is, in Bengal, nonetheless, for a very long time, there was a hegemony of the left in the sense that not only was there no communal riots, which of course the state can prevent, but the point is that, within Bengali social, intellectual life and so on.
There was genuine goodwill between communities. Yes.
And besides, there are hundreds of small left-wing journals, there still are, notwithstanding Mamata and BJP. I keep getting requests from them to kind of send some article and so small ones. So there is a very authentic battle of ideas taking place there. And in some sense, the left did have a hegemony in this battle of ideas all these years. By left, I don't mean just the communists. I mean left ideas generally. Yeah, Jawaharlal Nehru, I would include as part of these left ideas. What has happened of late, I think, is a dissonance, a disjunction between the people at large and the intelligentsia. I think even now, the left, in that broad sense, ideas are still the dominant ideas within the intelligentsia. I don't believe much of the intelligentsia has gone over to the BJP. You can easily see on this Kashmir, for instance. But what has happened is somewhere they have managed to get at people, and I think they have managed to get at people by inculcating deliberately a sense of insecurity and fear. There are several kinds of fear you can see. There's a fear of CBI and Enforcement Directorate. There's a fear of the lynch mobs. There is a fear of the Muslims. There's a fear of the terrorists. In other words, this is a society which has been literally fragmented, literally smashed to smithereens.
Conversion somewhere else.
So the point is that, the BJP's contribution has been to really smash a civil society that had a certain sense of solidarity into really fragment.
So in this battle for universal social rights, how would we build a mass support for it? What can we do differently, do you think? Is that too big an idea?
No, but I think this idea still has not been accepted, except briefly when you were in that advisory council, has not been accepted by the political class. Obviously, the whole of the political class wouldn't accept it, but even by significant segments of the political class.
I used to find in the National Advisory Council that it was, most of the Congress was not convinced about it at all. I remember that one week when the Food Security Act was being debated in Parliament. It was extraordinary because there was almost no one, even from the Congress party, willing to go and stand in its defense. And I was hopping from one television discussion to another because I don't belong to the party. I have a lot of difficulties with it. But the idea of, of ensuring food security as a near universal right, there was no one in the political establishment except from Mrs. Sonia Gandhi who seemed even willing to stand up and be counted on that idea. So there is absolutely, there's a much larger consensus.
But that is something which actually makes it all the more important, particularly in a society in which you have all this caste oppression and so on. The idea of an economic right or social right, which is universal, is very powerful. I remember when I was a kid, very small, the 1952 elections happened. And in the village where I was born and brought up, it was dominated by a set of Brahmin landlords. they were furious, infuriated that a Dalit actually had a right to vote, and actually he is going to determine the outcome of who's going to be elected. I mean, they were just so if you can imagine that happening at the political level, the idea of having a set of socio-economic rights is something which would be such an attack on the caste society. The first question would be, then where are we going to get our maids from?
Yeah. No, in fact, truly, my wife was telling me that in middle class women in Delhi were actually saying, if you vote the Congress because of his proposal, we won't get domestic helpers in our homes. This was actually a conversation when the Congress made that. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, it goes at it hits at the core of the idea that we our comfort level with inequality as something that is legitimate, that is how we built our lives, and they deserve their lives, we deserve our lives, and those kind. It's been a fascinating discussion, Prabhat, but the last question would be about the critique that it is a utopian idea because it's not feasible, we don't have the money. And as an economist, you've done your calculations, but how do you feel, obviously we'd have to reorganize how we spend existing public resources. So what changes there? But how would we actually be able to raise the kind of resources that we require for an idea of universal social rights, even if we stay with those 5 that you spoke about?
There are 2 levels at which this question can be answered. Firstly, purely financial resources. My calculations show that you would require about 10% of the GDP as additional expenditure in order to realize those 5 rights. And 10% of GDP can be quite easily raised financially because, let's say, I made a calculation that if you look at the total net worth in India today, wealth, is about 570 lakh crores. And if you take the top 1%, which owns roughly 60% of it, and you tax 2% of wealth tax, then you can raise about 6.6 lakh crores. And then any wealth tax is accompanied by an inheritance tax, naturally, otherwise you'd simply divide it up. And so even if you assume that the 5% of this wealth, of the top 1%, keeps changing hands every year, and you take away 1/3 of it, which, by the way, is perfectly compatible with the self-justification of capitalism. Capitalism says that you have wealth because you are talented.
Yes.
Therefore, there is no reason why your child should have wealth unless the child shows his talents. So the point is, if you do that, then you get another 5.5 lakh crores, and then that gives you 12 lakh crores. And really speaking, in order to spend 10%, you need to raise resources which are less than 10%, because any such expenditure has multiplier effects. Therefore, income increases, and therefore you get some tax revenue.
Can you explain, give an example of a multiplier effect?
You see, suppose you spend 100 rupees. Suppose you spend these 100 rupees simply by borrowing. In that case, these 100 rupees go to create someone else's income. That person spends the part of this, and that goes to create someone else's income who spends. So you have various rounds of demand being generated.
So the demand crisis would itself be addressed, and therefore.
So when you are actually looking at the sum total of all this, the income generated is some multiple of what you originally spent. Take a very conservative multiplier of 2. In which case, 100 rupees spent would give you 200 rupees of income. take a tax GDP ratio, which is let's say 15%, in which case actually that would give you 30 rupees of extra taxes. Therefore, in order to be able to sustain 100 rupees of spending, you really need to raise 70 rupees of additional resources. So in order to raise 10%, as I said, you need 7%. And 7% you can raise through wealth and inheritance tax. But the point is really not simply the financial side, because after all, the resources, the physical resources released by taxing people would be quite different from the physical resources being demanded when income is generated. And consequently, particularly, you'd have to raise food grains output, otherwise you'd get into a severe inflation. Okay, so it'll have to be part of a certain reordering of our entire development strategy.
Because there'll be much more demand of food because
Absolutely.
People will have.
Yeah.
But while all of this happens, another difficulty could be of state capacity. Do you think the state has the capacity to deliver universal social rights?
That state which institutes universal social rights would also have the capacity.
If we've got there, then we get there as well. Yeah.
Joan Robinson has a very good statement. She says that any state which can rectify the ills of the capitalist system can actually do away with the system altogether. And any state that cannot do away with the system lacks the will to rectify the mistakes. Yeah.
But our experience with the few rights that we were able to legislate, the food and education, etc. I just find there are moments where one recognizes that at least we have a recognition in law that these are rights, and it's not as if especially the Food Security Act. The scale of the PDS would not have been what it is, and children's school meals and some of that would be guaranteed. But even so, for right to education, I saw it required a raising of public spending from 3% to 6%, which just hasn't happened. And we're seeing a continuous erosion. And NREG, of course, all of us have seen that simply by delaying wage payment, for instance, inordinately, how will I then risk my coping mechanism? So I'll migrate and I won't depend, and so there is no demand. So we are so the killing by slow asphyxiation has taught me something more basic, and that's really to my final question. Is, to my mind, you can legislate universal social rights, but if we continue to be a society we do not believe that last human being of the disadvantaged caste, of the disadvantaged gender, deserves an equal chance in life. But Rohit Vemula had said, whatever I could do, I could not escape the fatal accident of my birth. To my mind, it summarizes, our cultural comfort with inequality. So to my mind, even more than an economic challenge, it's going to be a moral challenge for our society to take in hand this idea of the equal worth of every human being. Isn't that going to be the most important challenge?
Here we get back to where we had started, that what you said, the incapacity of the state is actually an aspect of class struggle. That the so-called incapacity is the way that the ruling classes hit back at you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because they have very selective incapacity.
That's right, exactly.
They can run beautiful airlines. Our domestic airlines are the best in the world if we want to do them.
So it manifests itself in terms of a so-called incapacity of the state. Now, and consequently, to overcome the incapacity, look at the way that they are whittling down the MGNREGS. In order to overcome that incapacity, people have to be organized along class lines in order to fight for their rights. So I would not put too much faith on a kind of moral awareness on the part of the better off, that these rights should be given to everybody universally. But I would certainly like a situation where those who get these rights really fight for them, struggle for them.
But also have a moral conviction
They
about
themselves.
the legitimacy.
Oh, absolutely.
I think they also have to believe in the legitimacy of that, that idea that I'm lazy and I'm being fed by the state, versus that I, as a human being, have the right to. I feel that a moral conviction also of the disadvantage.
But that is kind of ideologically becoming class conscious.
Yeah. Conscientization. Yes. So thank you so much, Prabhat. I mean, this is, as I said, going to be the first of, I hope, many conversations over the coming years, because I do believe that a challenge to what is happening in our country today is to stop just reacting to the agenda that the forces of Hindutva are laying before us, but for us to have our own confidence of our own agenda and have them react to it rather than the other way around. So thank you for actually kicking off this entire series of discussions. Thank you.
ये दाग दाग उजाला ये शब कसीदा सहर, वो इंतजार था जिसका ये वो सहर तो नहीं।